to reach that fair land past the sea. Help me to travel to my native country. Lord, now I beg you, have mercy on me. If it's convenient, will you please stand?
So chose, in that we don't have to be in fear of authority, but worship you freely. We pray that our worship was pleasing to you, Father, in every way. We thank you for the word we're about to receive. I pray that you be with Mr. Steve as he gives us the teaching of your word. I pray that we'd all be attentive and of quick understanding. Just help us to listen earnestly and have respect and reverence for how truly awesome it is to have your divine word, Lord. Help us to never take the fact that we have your word for granted, because other Christians, they don't have the word like we do. It's always there. It's always by our side, and we can always just read it and never have to fear of getting in trouble for reading the word, and we're always able to have the teaching of the word. Help us to never take it for granted, God. And I thank you that Jesus prayed that we'll be one, just as you and the Father are one. I pray these things, God, in Jesus' name, amen.
The next few lessons on Sunday evening are going to be looking at the focus and the attitude of our children when they come to worship God. Now, we're also going to be looking as well at all of us in our attitude, in our focus when we come to worship God, because what our children are seeing in us is going to translate into their own lives. And so I know as a parent, I know that sometimes Sundays for parents with young ones, it's almost like mom when you're at home and you're on the phone, right? It's like they didn't want anything from you all day until you pick up the phone. And it seems like sometimes Sunday mornings become that same similar type of situation, that the problems just all of a sudden, Sunday, there are all kinds of problems. You're trying to get ready to go to worship. And I wonder sometimes if that's one of Satan's tools of trying to get us distracted and trying to get us that they're using our own little devils against us to try to get our focus away from where it needs to be. But when I preach, I hear all of the noises. I see a lot of the wrestling matches that are going on, and for the most part, I love it. Now, as we talk through this and we see the focus that we're going to be taking over the next few weeks, that there are points that are made to make sure that as a whole, our worship together is as with as few of distractions as possible, and is as focused and as organized as it can possibly be to keep our minds focused on where they need to be. And so when we talk about all the noise, I say I love to hear the noises. I love to hear I take it as sometimes when I hear these little ones that they're the only ones here sometimes saying amen to me in my sermons. And but these noises, I think they mean something about this church, because there are too many churches that don't have the blessing of all these noises. There are a lot of churches that are, as their membership grows older, they're beginning to die away. because they don't have the young amongst them as well. It is a tremendous blessing. So we're going to be discussing what we need to focus on with our little ones to be training them to worship. And it really comes down to an attitude. And this is something for all of us. Because we can have an attitude with all of the noises and with all these things. We can have an attitude of, oh, did you hear just all that noise and all that? And there are times that it can get to a point to where it becomes distracting. That's something we'll talk about as well. As from a parent's point of view, how do I know? I want them to learn to sit here and be quiet, but I also don't want to be a distraction for those around me. And so there's kind of a fine balance between that. And we're going to be discussing a lot of those things as we go through. In some ways, this is going to be a very practical series of a few lessons as we look at this idea of parenting in the pews. When we talk about parenting in the pews, a thought that I want you to keep in your mind is the idea of paying attention. Paying attention is the key. I probably don't mean that in a way that you may initially think I do. And we're going to talk about that here in just a minute. But what I'm talking about is on what's happening in the minds of our children. Paying attention to our children while they're here in worship. And that's something I want to really talk about and think about. Now, I think back to our little ones. And my kids, those that are here, I just letting them know now you're fair game for anything I say about experiences that we had in the past. I told AJ, I said, you're going to be an illustration tonight. And he said, that's okay, I get ice cream. That was always the deal, that if I used them as an illustration in a sermon, that they got ice cream. And so when AJ was young, AJ, and I've said this before, this is nothing new, he was a tough one. He was stubborn. And there were a lot of challenges. Sundays sometimes were a real challenge. He was our first child. We thought we knew what we were doing. Before we had kids, we thought we knew what we were doing. And then we had one. And we realized that we don't have a clue. And we learned a lot along the way, and with the help of a lot of people along the way as well. But we were taught by our parents, and in this place as we're worshiping, there are a lot of wisdom that we got as far as how to help train and parent in the pews. And one of the things that was told to us is sit down front. When you have small children, sit towards the front. And the way my mother described that was there's less distractions. Your child, and when they're having to look through all these people, there's all these distractions that are taking place. We also learned that when you have a child sitting down front, that child many times becomes the distraction for a lot of the people sitting behind them. And so it's kind of a give and take sometimes. But my focus as a parent was, I'm trying to train that child to focus. Trying to help them to not have as many distractions as possible. And so when Jenny and when AJ was born, we were worshiping in a congregation, about 500, 600 members, fairly large congregation in Yukon, Oklahoma. And so we're sitting down front, and AJ wasn't that old before he started doing things in worship to where he knew he wasn't supposed to do. And every parent knows that moment when they do things, but there's that one time, that first time that you realize, oh, he just did that to see what I would do. He knew that he wasn't supposed to do that. And so now as a parent, you've got a decision to make. How do I deal with this? Because it has to be dealt with. You have to make sure that a lesson is taught. And so thus began this life of marching out and disciplining and talking. I learned later from my kids, I said, we so much rather would have had the spankings than the lectures. We would go out and we would spank a bottom for not acting the properly in worship. And then we would have a conversation as to why. This is why this happened. And even with a small one, holding them in your arms and talking to them, this isn't how we act in worship. And so we're going to go back in. and we're going to sit down, we're going to be quiet, we're going to be still, and we're going to pay attention. We're going to focus. And as many times with AJ, about 5 minutes later, I was back up, walking back out the back doors, and we sat in the front. So we walked all the way out the back, and we didn't come in after that time of discipline and then sit in the back. No, we walked all the way back to the front because Mom said, sit in the front. So that's what we did. And for a long time, as we walked out that back door, I was noticing the faces of a lot of the other parents. Parents that were older than us that had kids the same age as us. Because we started very, very young. We were barely out of diapers ourselves when we started having kids in diapers. And so as there were parents in their 30s and 40s who had children the same age as ours. And so we're walking out, and a lot of times we're wondering, are we doing something wrong? Are we messing our kids up? We're not sure exactly if this is what we need to be doing. Nobody else, very few others were doing what we were doing. And so we kind of wondered, and we struggled. And there was one time I even went to one of our elders, and I told him, I said, I don't feel like we're getting anything out of worship because we are just focusing on trying to get our children to keep their mouths shut and not be a distraction to other people. And this is hard. I don't feel like I'm getting anything out of worship. And he said, you're getting a whole lot more out of worship than you realize you are. And we didn't understand that until maybe 22 years later. When we're able to look back and to see what we really were getting by trying to do that. Well, then our kids got a little bit older. They get to 10, 11, 12 years old, and we would have people coming to us. I've told some of you this before. We'd have people come to us and say, you and Jenny are so lucky. Your kids sit still and they pay attention and they take notes and they just, you are so lucky to have kids. And we would look at them like, luck. This had nothing to do with luck. And this was a lot of work and a lot of struggle and a lot of trying to figure out if we're doing things right. And Jenny and I, we weren't the perfect parents in worship. That's not why I'm saying any of this. We made a lot of mistakes. We were not always consistent. When we knew we needed to be, sometimes we decided to take the easy way out and not be consistent. And there were a lot of challenges and a lot of struggles that we dealt with. But we learned that training our children to worship was getting something out of it, even for us. In the long term, it was worth it. And we knew that that's what God wanted us to be focused on. And this may be, parents, the most important thing that you teach your children to do. And when I make a statement like that, I stopped and think about it for a while. Because that's a pretty strong statement. Of all the things that you're ever going to teach your children, but I feel confident in saying it. The time of teaching them to worship their God may be the most important thing you will ever teach them to do, and to do the way that God desires for them to do. And so, worship, if you think about it, this is the only thing that we're going to be doing for eternity. Everything else is temporary. Everything else is here in this life. But when this life is over, we are going to continue to be praising God before His throne and worshiping Him. And so why not spend the time and the effort in trying to help our children to navigate this challenge sometimes of what worship is really supposed to be all about. Now, from my experience, growing up in the church, grew up in an elder's home. My mother was a Bible class teacher. I knew where we were going to be every single Sunday, every single Wednesday. It wasn't an option. It wasn't a question. We knew that every time the church was gathered together, we knew where we were going to be. But there was something that I began to realize later on in life. I realized that I believe I had been learning more about how to go to church instead of how to go to worship. And these are two very different things. A lot of people don't understand the difference between those two, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. In our home, you won't hear us say that we're going to church. That's not a statement we make. We talk about going to worship. We want to focus on the why we're there, not the where we're going. We want to make sure that, and it's those small things, that's pretty insignificant. Does it really make that big of a difference? Even those very small things, small words, the language that we use like that, it begins to plant seeds into the minds of our children of preparing them for what we're going to do when we get there. And so we're not just going to be with the church. We're not just going to church. We are here for the purpose of worship, of acknowledging and praising and honoring our God. And there are many parents who struggle week after week in worship. And you know, it's tempting for many. I've talked to many. It's tempting for them just to stay at home. Man, it's just not worth the fight. It's a battle every time. Some children are more challenged to get through worship than others. And so it's a battle, it's a fight. Because of some of these struggles, there are some who are tempted to remove our children from our worship service. Say, let's have a separate service for our children. That way we can get rid of the distractions. We can get rid of, mom and dad can focus, and we'll just separate that, and we'll begin to take the children away from that worship assembly. I've asked people that talk about that and talk about that type of a practice to say, what if we pose that question to Jesus? If we could pose to Jesus the idea of, let's remove the children from our worship, how do you think Jesus would respond? I believe Jesus has already responded. In Luke chapter 18, Jesus responded with this very issue, because we don't know exactly what the little children were doing, but it was something that was annoying the apostles to the point that they were trying to make them stop. And what was Jesus' response? Let the little children come to me. They're children. Children are going to be children. Whatever it was about these kids, whatever they were doing, or wherever they were going, whatever they were causing, the apostles were, no, this isn't the time, this isn't the place. And Jesus is saying, this is exactly the time. This is exactly the place. Because of how important it is to instill all of this into the minds and the hearts of what Jesus had to offer. Now, when I say that we need to focus more on paying attention, I'm talking about not paying attention to the preacher. That's not what I'm talking about. That's something I want to teach my children, but that's not my main focus here. I'm talking about paying attention to your children while you're here in worship. It wasn't until I started paying closer attention to my children in worship that I began to see all kinds of opportunities to be able to teach. I mean, just imagine some of these little ones around here, maybe even if you have a 5-year-old, then you watch a 5-year-old during worship. And they're going to be observing people and what they're doing. And a lot of times, they don't have any context to understand why people are doing what they're doing. But they're watching and they're observing, and too many times, we don't help to explain and teach and describe to them, this is what they're doing. This is why they're doing it. And we miss out on those opportunities to help teach. We sometimes just assume that, well, they see it every week, they're going to figure it out. And we need to make sure that we're taking the opportunities to be able to teach. It probably wasn't until Jace came into our family. Yes, you get ice cream now too, bud. Liberty's over here going, when's it my turn? When Jace came into our life, when he was 1.5 years old, and seeing him in worship, a 1.5-year-old who had never been to a worship assembly before, never been, and to see his eyes, that's when it hit me for the first time. I began to realize he has no idea. This is strange. Everything's strange. Everything's new. And so I began to try to look for those opportunities to help him to understand this is what we're doing and why we're doing it. I've mentioned before that, when he was very young, the Lord's Supper would be passed by, and at that age, he had no idea what we were doing. As many children don't. They see it happen all the time, but they don't know what's really happening. And so I would take that opportunity, and we would talk. At the time when, I know, you're supposed to be quiet and bow your head and be contemplating and thinking about the sacrifice of Christ and all of that, I understand. I wasn't doing that. I was paying attention to my child. And I was seeing the questions in his face. And so our conversations, I'd be asking a lot of questions, and I'd do it quietly. I didn't want to distract other people. But I would say, do you know what that is? Do you know what we're doing? Do you know what that means? Do you know what that bread is? Do you know what that fruit of the vine, that grape juice, do you know what that represents, what that's all about? You know about what Jesus did for us? And we're remembering that. We're telling him thank you. And I would look at those opportunities of realizing this child doesn't know in his world what all this is about. And I began to see for the very first time, I've missed I missed a lot of opportunities with my other children to take advantage of those moments every possible time I could to help them to know and understand better why and what we were doing. Sometimes I think we forget how easy it is for our children to be distracted. When I was 10 years old, and I've told this before too, when I was 10 years old sitting in the church building in Scott City, Kansas, I could tell you the exact number of bricks that it was to go from the floor to the ceiling on either side of the auditorium. I could point out all of the images. The whole front of the auditorium was all wood panel. And I've mentioned this before. I could point out all of the pictures that were in the wood paneling. That right over this door that went back into the baptistry, there was an alligator that was in the wood paneling in the grain of the wood. Over here, it was kind of scary, even as a kid. There was the, what's he called? The Grim Reaper. And he even had a scythe. And it was all right there. And see, that's the 10-year-old's mind sitting here in a time of worship, is distractions and things all over the place. And nobody, when they put that wood paneling up, they had no idea that was going to be a distraction for 10-year-old Steve. But 10-year-old Stephen, I was Stephen then. But those are the types of things. I have heard from you about the lady in the baptistry wearing the hat. And as a matter of the last time that I talked about all of this, Sharon was the one who said, have you ever seen the lady in the baptistry? And I had never seen it until she pointed out. And now every time I walk in here, I see the lady on the wall in the baptistry wearing a hat. But distractions are everywhere. And for our children, it is so much more difficult than it is for us even. And we as adults, we know how we can be distracted. But our children's minds are constantly working overtime, and we need to use that to our advantage. Instead of allowing it to be a distraction, pulling their minds away from what they need to be focused on, we can use that to draw their minds closer to what they need to be focused on. I found this, and I've shown this before. I found this book. It was an old book. Be quiet, sit still, don't wriggle. It was a book that was in many church libraries. And it was teaching the lesson of when we're in worship, this is how we act. We're quiet, and we sit still, and we don't wriggle. And these are all great things that we need to be working on with our children in worship. They're all very, very good things for them to learn. But this is different than the focus that God took on this very point. Because God also said to his people when he was telling them how to worship, he also told them to be still. But how did he say it? In Psalm 46 and verse 10, he said, be still and know that I am God. Now, God is not talking about and just dealing with be still and don't wiggle. What God is speaking of is be still. Be still in your heart. Be still in your mind. And know, acknowledge that I am your God. That was the focus that God wanted to have when it came to those who were worshiping him. So when we see something like that, the difference is really our perception of worship. See, God, in the way that he was seeing what he was trying to accomplish in training his children to worship him, if this aspect of worship is taken care of, the sitting still, being quiet, and not wiggling is going to begin to take care of itself. There does need to be some correction. There does need to be some training in teaching to sit still and be quiet. That was many trips. I got more exercise on Sunday mornings going in and out of worship sometimes than I did any other time of the week. And that's all part of it. Is that's not how we act in worship, and we're going to train that. But if that's all we're training, then we're not teaching them why. Why do I need to sit still? Why do I need to be quiet? Why do I need to listen and pay attention? Why do I need to do all that? I'm afraid there are a lot of children that never were told and taught the why. They were just told the how. Just sit there, don't make any noise, and we expect them to be able to develop and learn on their own the why we're doing all of this. Well, in my teenage years, I sometimes was focused on the burden that it was to go to church. That's where my focus was a lot of times in my teenage years. It's hard. And is this really what I want to do? Instead of focusing on why I was there. And this is the difference. I think between these two pictures here, this is the difference. This is more of the going to church. And again, those things are great. We need to be teaching them. But the difference between going to church and going to worship is the why we're there. Not just an event that we do. Not just an activity that's a part of our week and our schedule. But why we are coming together to worship our God. So if we take the context on one side of going to church, why do people just go to church? If that's the mindset, usually, maybe it's, well, I promised my parents. I promised my grandparents. I promised somebody that that's what I would do. Maybe it's more along the line of, I know I'm expected to. I'm expected to be there. I'm even expected by God to be there. Maybe for some, it's even an image thing. That I need for people to see me at church. And because if they don't see me, then it's about the way that the way they'll think about me. And so it's maybe an image thing. And all of those types of things, I believe, are symptoms of an attitude of what am I getting out of church? What am I getting out of it when I go to church? It's all about how do people see me because I'm there. And you see, these were my thoughts. When I would take a little redhead out the back door, one of the main things in my mind was, what do I look like to all these other parents? How are they seeing me? My focus and my purpose of being there and doing what I was doing was not right. And again, I think we need to be careful of that. Well, if we take the other side of why do we go to worship? You see, just in the wording, the answer is different. Why do I worship? It's not about me. It's not about what I'm getting out of it. Now it's about what can I give? What am I able to do to participate in the time that I'm there? It's not about what people think about me, but about what God is thinking about me. And when my focus is right, the way that I pay attention to my children during that time of worship is going to change. And the things that I'm going to notice are going to change. It's not just about sitting still and being quiet. I'm going to teach those things. But now it's about why we are here and why our God deserves our reverence. Why does our God deserve your respect? Because when you're making noise and you're not sitting still, you're not showing him respect. It's teaching them the reason behind it, not just what to do. And so we're talking about preparing our children to come into the presence of their Creator, to be before him. And it's very easy for us sometimes to get into a rut. You know, we come every Sunday morning. We're here every Sunday night. We're here every Wednesday night. And it just becomes a part of the schedule. It just becomes a part of this is just what we do. And it's easy to get into a rut. But when we do this, we lose the essence of coming to praise and to glorify the Almighty God. It's not just something we do, but there is so much more behind why we're doing it. And I don't want my children to lose that purpose of why we're here. So, one thing we need to understand is that worship does not come naturally. It's not something that's natural. As a matter of fact, do you realize how hard God had to work to teach the children of Israel how to worship him? You realize how much he went through to get them to understand what worship was supposed to be like? And all the ways that he taught, he did this in a couple of ways. When he was teaching the children of Israel to worship, one of the first things that he would do is he would give them general guidelines, like what we saw, be still. Be still and know that I am God. That is a very worshipful thought. But it wasn't just the general ideas. God also gave them a lot of very specific commands to go along with that. Some things like, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. That's a very specific command that they needed to do. You must use this specific kind of fire for that offering. You must use this specific type of animal sacrifice for that kind of sin that you committed. And everything that God commanded had a specific reason for them, even if they didn't understand why they were doing it. Even if they didn't understand the meaning behind it. Why do I need to use a ram for this sacrifice instead of a turtle dove? Why? They didn't understand a lot of it. But God was trying to get them to understand there's a reason. And you might not see it. You might not get it. So when we're training our children, we need to have that same focus. Is that you might not understand it all right now, but I need you to trust me that there's a reason. There's a purpose, and we need to be teaching them what those purposes and what those reasons really are. He does the exact same thing with us today. God has had to train us as Christians in the church, doing the exact same thing. He gives us some very general guidelines. Jesus says in John 4:24, he says that we are to worship in spirit and in truth. That's very general. There are a lot of things that go into worshiping in spirit and in truth. But then he also gives us a lot of specifics that fill that generic command. Not forsaking the assembly. Very similar to keep the Sabbath day. You say there's a place that when I designate it that you are to be, you need to be there. And so he gives specific commands. Sing. When you worship me, sing. The elements of the Lord's Supper. Very specific in what he's given us, of what he wants us to observe and how we are to observe it. And so this is how God is saying, this is worship to me. Under the old law, he had very specific things. Under the new law, he has very specific things. This is how you worship me. If we go away from any of the things that God has told us he wants in his worship, then we are no longer worshiping him. It's about us and what we want instead of what he desires from us. So we do everything we can to obey him, not to make it convenient for us, but to be obedient to him. So we need to start asking some of those questions. Questions that our children may be asking themselves. Questions like, so why are we here? When we come to worship God, why are we here? What's the purpose? If the reason is because it's what my family does, or it's something that's just expected of me. Or the reason why I'm here is because I know it's the right thing to do. That might be a true statement. It is the right thing to do. But if these things alone are the reason for why you're here, if this is what our children are learning from us of why we're here, then these things alone are not going to connect the hearts of our children to the heart of God. There's so much more to binding the hearts of our children to the heart of God. If it just becomes something that we have to do because I'm supposed to, then we're not really teaching our children to love and honor and respect and worship their God the way that He has called them to do so. Learning to worship is different than anything else you will ever do. When your children learn to worship God, there is nothing on the face of planet Earth that is anything like what we're trying to teach them to do here in this place. And it's supposed to be different. It's not supposed to be like things in the world. But because, I've heard it said by many parents, sometimes Sunday morning can be the longest hour of the week. And there are a lot of moms and dads that can relate to that statement. It can be a long day. Because of some of the struggle that they're faced with. But this is when our attitude is focused on, what am I getting out of it? I'm not getting anything out of worship. You remember, that's the question. That's what the comment I made to my elder one time. I don't feel like we're getting anything out of worship. And his wisdom, he understood and he knew, yes, you are. You can't see it right now, but yes, you are. And so we would have all kinds of older members come up to us and they would tell us, they'd say, just keep doing what you're doing. It's going to be worth it. Just keep being consistent. Keep training. And so we trusted them. And we think that it worked pretty good to have that focus in mind of helping them to focus on what they needed to. Now, worship, and this is really the mindset that we need to all try, especially parents with young ones, really need to try to keep in our hearts and our minds, is that worship can provide the best opportunity to prepare our families for eternity. This moment, and we only do it really once a week. I mean, we have Wednesday nights and Sunday nights, but it's the time of focus of worship, very, very little time during the week that we do it together. And so in this time, it's only when our attitude is focused on how much is God going to get out of this. That's something our children need to know as we're preparing their minds and hearts to come to worship. Not just go to church, but to come to worship. What is God going to get from you when you worship Him today? What will God hear from you? What is He going to see from you? The way that you're acting, the way that you're treating your friends, the way that you're sitting in worship, the attention that you're giving to everything that we're doing in worship. What is God going to get from you? Because children automatically are selfish. Children, the mindset of a child, it's about me. It starts when they're tiny babes. It's a selfishness that's God-given, because when they get hungry, all they're concerned about is make me happy. When they need to be changed, all they're concerned about is I'm not comfortable, make me happy. It's a very selfish way of thinking. And so it's our responsibility to help them understand this is not about you. When we come into this place, it's not about what you're getting out of it. So if our children walk away from worship and they're going, well, I didn't get the toys that I wanted to play with. Or I didn't get the snack that you told me I was going to get to have. Or I didn't get, and it's all about what am I going to get when I go to worship today? Then we've missed it. We need to start changing that and helping them to understand. And if we put that thought in their head, of what are you going to give to God today? What is He going to see from you? Then that begins to help change the way that they view what we're doing while we're here. This is no longer just something that we do because it's Sunday morning. This is something that I get to do because I get to offer something to God. I get to worship Him. If worship is seen like this, then our children's minds are being molded to understand the purpose of all this. If our children learn to understand the purpose of why we're here, the be quiets and the sit stills are going to begin to take care of themselves. When they begin to understand the purpose of worship, why we're sitting in the pews, then they begin to realize the importance of what it means to pay attention, to learn, to be quiet, to not be a distraction and make loud noises, because the person next to me is also trying to give something to God. And I don't want to be a distraction for them in their responsibility, and they're trying to give to God too. And so if we help them to understand these purposes, then those other things will begin to take care of themselves. And when they don't, we march right back out the door again, and we discipline, and we talk, and we train, and we discuss. This is not the way God wants us. What you're doing is about you. You threw a fit because of what you want. What does God want from you? What does God desire to see from you? And so it's important for us also to realize that the same is true for us as adults. If my heart and my focus on God is right, my actions are going to follow. And this is really, for our children, this is where it all begins. This is where the mindset begins to be planted for why one day they are going to obey the gospel and become Christians themselves. This is the mindset that is necessary for them to understand that when I become a Christian, I am going to remain faithful to my God for the rest of my life, because it's not about me. It's about what I'm giving to Him. And to maintain that faithfulness until they're no longer here. We're going to be looking at, and maybe there may have been a little more expectation tonight of more specific, very practical suggestions and things pertaining to this parenting in the pews. And we're going to be talking about some of those things. We're going to be talking about discipline. And we're going to talk more about preparing their minds to worship. What happens during worship? And paying attention more to our children why they're worshiping and how we can use those things. What about prayer? How can we prepare them and teaching them and training them about giving, about the Lord's Supper, about all of these aspects that are going on in worship, and how we can use that easily distracted mind to focus it so that they can understand better why we're doing what we're doing. As parents and grandparents, I want you to try to think of coming to worship this way. Think of it as bringing your children to introduce them to Almighty God. When we come to worship, as a parent, I want to see this as though when I walk in with my family, I am coming to introduce my family to my God. This is my family. I want you to know my family. But at the same time, I want to make sure that I am introducing God to my family. I want my children to know this is my God. This is my Creator. This is the Almighty. And this is why we do what we do. So that's going to be kind of the center point of the next couple of lessons here on Sunday evening, as we look at some more practical things pertaining to what actually happens during our time of worship. But I thought we needed to start here, because we need to understand the difference between we're going to church and we're going to worship. We're just going because it's a part of our schedule, and we're going because this is a part of our life. This is what's in my heart. And there is a reason why I do it. Not just because mom drags me and makes me be there, but because there is something that is so much more important for my purpose of worshiping our God. Whether it's our worship to God and training our children about worship, or any other aspect of their spiritual life, one of the most important things is going to be, what are they seeing from us? What are they hearing from me? How do they hear me talk about things that went on during worship? Am I complaining about the songs were too slow, or the preacher preached too long, or that's usually what my kids hear me complain about. But it's those types of things that what are they hearing about how we describe that moment, that event that we just had in being able to worship our God? Is there any conversation? This is something I have fallen short on many, many times and still do many times. What is our conversation with our children about what happened right here? Because this is the most important thing that's going to happen in your week, is kneeling before the throne of God and acknowledging Him as your sustainer, submitting to Him and letting Him know how thankful you are for the sacrifice that He gave for you. But do we spend very much time talking about that? I know as a father, as a coach, after a basketball game, what did me and my kids talk about a lot? We'd talk game. We'd talk strategy. We'd talk about what we didn't do right. We'd talk about what we could do better next time. We talk about all these different types. How are we going to practice better next week to get better at what we're doing? Why do we not do that with this? And maybe you do. I haven't been that good at it. There have been times that we did better than others, but I haven't been consistent with that all the time. I need to be reminded to be able to take my family, to take my children and say, how did worship go? What did you struggle with today? Is there something that we can do better? A way that we can present ourselves to God better next week? Is there something that I can do to offer more to Him than I offered to Him this time? What do we need to do to practice this week to be ready and prepared for what we're going to do next week for Him? And that sounds like strange talk when it comes to worship. But the only reason it's strange is because it's not something that we spend a lot of time thinking about. And it probably should. So when it comes to what happens here, there's probably more that's going to happen at home before we get here than what's actually happening here in this room. My mom, growing up, the sit still, be quiet, it didn't happen here. It did. I sat right here. My mom and dad sat right there, third pew. I sat right here, and this earlobe was bruised from the time I was about 10 years old till I was 18. Because every time I would do something, I'd get that thump right on the back of the ear. But my sitting still and being quiet, it happened on our couch, our brown paisley couch in our living room at home. Because my mom, if I struggled sitting still in worship, guess what we did when we got home? You need to sit there and don't move. I was being trained to do the be still, sit quiet when I was at home on the couch. And then she was able to focus on other things when we got here. We were able to focus on the why we do what we do when we're in this place. And so the importance of things changed. And so it's something I think we need to think about. Think about all of this over the next couple of weeks when we talk about those practical ways of helping our children to focus. And when we do that, what we're also talking about is I've got to make sure that I'm focused, that I have my perception of worship where it needs to be as well, as do all of us. Whether I have children or not, I might say, well, I don't even have children. I don't know if I need to be here. And say, there are children that are in this room who are watching you, every single one of you. And they're watching what happens. And so we need to be conscious of that, because you can be sometimes a better trainer of these children than their parents are on Sunday morning. And so I hope that this will be something that you can gain from. All of us are able to. But there's something tonight that in your lives, maybe it's a parenting thing. struggle, a challenge. Maybe it's something even with our children as we have children that get older. There's still burdens, there's still challenges and struggles, there's still things that we pray about. And is there something that as the body that we can come together and strengthen each other, pray for each other, so that we can encourage each other to be better within our own homes, our own families, better than we've ever been, and grow stronger for God. The stronger our families are, the stronger the church will be. So if there is any need tonight of any kind, your spiritual walk with God, will you make that known? You can do that if you'll come forward as we stand, as we sing this song.
Man of sorrows, what a name for the Son of God who came, ruined sinners to reclaim. Hallelujah, what a Savior, bearing shame and scoffing rude. In my place condemned he stood, sealed my pardon with his blood. Hallelujah, what a Savior. Guilty, vile, and helpless we,
Pew as we sing a purple robe, and you'll be served. A purple robe, a crown of thorns, a reed in his right hand. Before the soldiers fight and scorn, I see my Savior stand. He bears between the Roman it's convenient, let's all stand.